I've always been surrounded by contemporary American poetry. When I was in college, I went to college in '26. There was a little bookstore in Cambridge. I was at Harvard. There was a little bookstore around the corner that sold modern books. It was sort of a little rather secret because people didn't like that kind of thing. And at that time, William Carlos Williams was printing little volumes of his poetry paid for by himself. And I bought them. And ever since that time, I've been fascinated by him. I must say, at the same time, I bought volumes of Gertrude Stein, and I didn't get so fascinated by her as and also, of course, T.S. Eliot, and a great many other things. I went also to Europe at those times. My father took me to France and Europe in the early 20s, right after the First World War. And so I bought books there. I bought James Joyce's Ulysses, which was forbidden in the United States, and I had to sneak it in from the first edition of it, and so that the customs officer wouldn't take it away from me. I remember that. So that I've been involved with this field of modernism for a great part of my life. In fact, my whole life, which was certainly from 1923 or 4. And when we moved into this apartment, E. Cummings lived around the corner. I used to see him on the street. And then down 2 blocks below, Marianne Moore lived here too. And then, of course, I've been interested, as you are, in Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And Robert Benoit tried to convince me that Melville was one of America's great poets, but I'm still doubtful.
What these poets you've been talking about have in common, Pound and Wallace Stevens and William Carlos Williams, they were founders of modernism, which is the culture that you've grown up in.
Well, it was actually mainly the thought of Ezra Pound. He was a big mover in all of this, and he, for instance, was very much against the romantic poetry of people like Swinburne and Tennyson, or here Longfellow, and felt that poetry should express in simple, direct terms, and especially in direct words, what is the poet, and he often said that it was important to have things in the poem rather than to have fantasies of one kind or another, so that all of these poets, and this is not true of Emily Dickinson, although it's partially true, that she also even avoided the romantic type of thing, like this is the forest primeval and so forth, which Longfellow and William Cullen Bryant and various other American poets followed. And it was really a very novel point of view in American poetry. Whitman had a good deal to do with this, because he also used commonplace language almost all the time. And so that this was a whole movement that developed and spread and turned its back on the more conventional, so to speak, poetic character of poetry. And you know, after all, one of the William Carlos Williams' earliest poetry is about a red wheelbarrow, and all he's saying in the poem is that it's a very important thing in a person's life, in a farmer's life, and That's quite a wonderful idea, you know, that just to take something very simple, very commonplace, and to see something important in it.
You've been writing vocal music. You began writing vocal music very early because you were involved with singing at Harvard. You were a member of the Harvard Glee Club, and then wrote a piece for them, I think, in 1936, and quite a lot of choral music in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, well, I was a member of the Harvard Glee Club, and the Harvard Glee Club at that time was really quite a wonderful thing because, I don't know if it still is, but it was a wonderful group because we were involved with the Boston Symphony, so that we sang the B minor Mass of Bach and the Brahms Requiem, and it was a very important thing in my life, actually, to learn how to sing. I didn't have a very good voice, but I learned all about how to write counterpoint and how it sounded. We sang many madrigals, somewhat arranged for men's voices, and it gave me particularly an interest in the Renaissance madrigal and other kinds of music, which could persist and still does persist in my life. We had, after all, my generation was a generation that lived as musicology began to discover the past and deeply discovered, so that there were many kinds of ideas that were coming into us that people, like even in the time of Brahms, that people didn't know much about, and musicians didn't, and we got to know all sorts of things. We got to know Guillaume de Machaut and Perrotin, all kinds of things that were very influential on our thinking. In fact, one of the things that I must say about the vocal pieces that I've written in recent times, including this of Rewaking, is a result of having been very interested in plain song, and the idea was that plain song was something that went on without the kind of formal structure that German Lieder had, but went on in a kind of floating, not expressing in some way the character of whatever the words were, but not actually following a musical form.
And never repeating itself exactly.
And never repeated it, so.
There was a period from the 40s to the 70s when you weren't writing vocal music, but even then I noticed that you were often thinking about poems while writing instrumental music, concerto for orchestra or...
Well, the big problem with my vocal music was that I did write, I think the last of the vocal pieces I wrote was actually the settings of Robert Frost's songs, for Robert Frost poems. And as like many young composers of that time, we did not have access to very good singers. And I always had such lousy performances, I finally decided I didn't want to go on writing choral music because it just sounded so, vocal music, because it sounded so awful. People sang it without understanding it. It was a very trying situation. I wrote that thing on Hart Crane, Voyage, and really the singers had a great time, great difficulty in singing it. And you have to realize that my music that is now taught in schools was considered, when it was written, as very advanced modern music, like the Hart Crane poem, particularly my cello sonata, in which I had such trouble getting a cello sonata printed because no publisher would publish anything that was so advanced and so unusual. And now, of course, it seems like an old corny thing even to me.